What if the teachings you've always heard about Jesus were never the full message, but only a surface layer hiding a deeper way of seeing reality itself, waiting to be awakened inside you? There is something I need to tell you at the very beginning, something I could easily keep as a quiet thought, but it keeps returning in a way I can't ignore, and I want to be honest with you about that. Because the moment I started seriously sitting with certain teachings attributed to Jesus, not as something to debate, but as something to reflect on deeply, I began noticing a strange tension inside myself. It wasn't confusion in the usual sense. It was more like realizing that what I thought I understood might only be the surface layer of something much deeper than I had ever been taught to see. And I don't say this as a claim. I say it as an experience I've been moving through slowly, and I want to share that process with you, not above you, but beside you, because maybe you felt something similar without fully naming it. Maybe there are moments when familiar spiritual ideas suddenly feel larger than the way they were originally explained to you. Not because the teachings are wrong, but because something inside you is asking for a deeper way of seeing them. And I think that's where we begin. Welcome to it, Bible Talesis 07. I'm glad you're here with me in this moment, because what we are about to explore is not just about interpreting words from the past, but about questioning the way we perceive meaning itself in the present. And I want to ask you something very directly. What if there is a dimension of understanding that we were never really taught how to access? Not because it was deliberately hidden in a dramatic sense, but because we were never encouraged to slow down enough to notice it? There is a line that has stayed with me more than I expected. The eye is the lamp of the body. At first, it feels almost too familiar to question. Something poetic, something complete, something we pass over because we assume we already understand it. But I started realizing that the most familiar ideas are often the ones we stop examining too quickly. And when I stopped and stayed with it, I began to feel that it might not be talking about sight in the way we normally think of sight, but something deeper, something internal, something connected to how we actually experience reality from within. And I don't want to rush that idea, because the moment we rush, we turn reflection into conclusion, and I don't think that's what this moment is asking from us. It feels more like an invitation than an answer. An invitation to look again, more slowly, more honestly, at how we see, how we interpret, and how awareness itself shapes what we call reality. And if you're willing to stay with me through this journey, I think what we will discover is not just an interpretation of ancient words, but something about the way we are living and perceiving right now, in this very moment. If this kind of exploration speaks to you, I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel. It truly helps me continue creating these deeper reflections, and it means a lot more than you might think, because this is only the beginning of what we are about to uncover together. And as I continued sitting with that feeling that perception itself might hold a deeper key to understanding these teachings, I realized that I couldn't stay only at the level of questioning anymore, because the question itself started pointing me somewhere else. It was as if once you begin to examine how you see, you inevitably start noticing the structure of seeing itself. And that is where something very subtle began to emerge in my reflection. Not as an idea I was trying to prove, but as something I was observing in real time within my own experience. Because when I look closely at how I move through life, I begin to notice that I don't always experience reality as a single, unified flow. There are moments when everything feels scattered, as if my attention is being pulled in multiple directions at once. Thoughts overlap. Emotions respond before I fully understand them. Memories color the present moment without me consciously choosing it. And in those moments, even simple things can feel heavier than they actually are. Not because the world itself has changed, but because the way I am perceiving it is fragmented. And then, without any dramatic shift, there are other moments where something quietly reorganizes itself inside. The noise doesn't completely disappear, but it softens. Attention becomes more steady, and reality feels less like something I am struggling to interpret, and more like something I am simply aware of. And that contrast is what made me start paying closer attention to the idea of a single eye. Not as a physical concept, and not as something I need to define in a rigid way, but as a possible metaphor for unified perception. A way of seeing that is not constantly divided between competing inner voices. A way of awareness that is not fragmented by fear in one moment and hope in the next, judgment in one direction and desire in another. Because when I reflect honestly, I can see how often my inner experience is not unified at all. It is layered, sometimes even conflicting with itself. And yet, in rare moments of clarity, those layers seem to align without effort. Not because I forced them into order, but because something in me became still enough to witness them without immediately reacting. And in those moments, perception feels different, more direct, less distorted. Almost as if I am no longer standing in the middle of internal noise trying to make sense of everything, but instead observing life from a quieter center. And that experience made me start wondering if what is being pointed to in symbolic language like the eye is the lamp of the body might be describing exactly this shift in perception. Not a new belief, not a doctrine, but a state of awareness where seeing becomes unified rather than divided. Because when perception is fragmented, everything feels like interpretation layered on top of interpretation. But when perception is more unified, there is a kind of simplicity that appears. Not simplicity of ideas, but simplicity of experience itself. And I want to stay careful here, because I am not trying to define this as a final explanation. I am only noticing how this idea begins to reflect something that can actually be observed within us. Something that is not far away or abstract, but present in how we experience even this very moment. And maybe that is why this question continues to stay alive in me, because it doesn't feel like a concept to solve. It feels like a way of seeing that is waiting to be recognized. And as I continued sitting with the possibility that perception itself might be the real key behind everything we've been exploring, my attention slowly began to shift again, this time towards something even more intimate and closer to everyday human experience. Because once you start observing how perception works, you inevitably begin to notice the space in which perception actually happens. Not the objects of awareness, but awareness itself. And this is where my reflection naturally moved into something I had always heard about in spiritual language, but never really understood in a lived, experiential way. The idea of the human being as a kind of inner structure. A living space where experience is not just happening randomly, but where everything we think, feel, and notice seems to arise within something deeper that holds it all together. When I first encountered the idea that you are the temple, I honestly used to treat it as symbolic language meant to inspire reflection, but not necessarily something to take too literally or examine too deeply. But the more I stayed with everything we've been exploring together, the more that phrase started to shift in meaning. Not as a statement about religion or physical space, but as a possible way of pointing toward inner experience itself. Because when I look at my own life honestly, I begin to notice something very simple but very consistent. Most of the time, I am not fully aware of the space in which my thoughts are appearing. I am inside the thoughts, reacting to them, moving through them, identified with them. And in that state, everything feels immediate and real, but also fragmented. Thoughts come quickly. Emotions rise and fall. Memories influence perception without invitation, and it feels like I am moving through experience without ever really stepping back to notice the structure in which all of this is happening. But there are other moments, much quieter ones, where something shifts. Not dramatically, not in a way that feels supernatural, but subtly. And in those moments, I am able to notice that thoughts are happening within awareness, rather than being the totality of who I am. Emotions are being experienced, but not completely controlling the space of experience. And there is a kind of background presence that remains steady even as everything else moves. And when I started noticing that, I began to understand why symbolic language might describe the human being as a temple. Because a temple, in its most basic sense, is not defined only by what enters it, but by the space that holds everything within it. It is a place where attention is gathered, where experience is not scattered into chaos, but contained within a structured space of presence. And when I reflect on that metaphor inwardly, I start to see that the temple might not be something external we visit or believe in, but something we are already inhabiting without always realizing it. A living inner space where awareness, thought, emotion, and perception all arise and dissolve. And yet, most of the time, we don't experience it as a unified space. We experience it as being lost inside its contents, which is why moments of awareness feel so significant when they appear. Because in those moments, even briefly, we are no longer completely absorbed in what is happening inside us. we are also aware of the fact that it is happening, and that shift changes everything. Not because anything external changes, but because the relationship between awareness and experience becomes clearer. And I find myself wondering if this is what certain teachings were pointing toward when they used the language of temples, inner dwelling, or sacred space. Not as physical instructions, but as invitations to notice where experience is actually occurring. Because if this inner space is always present, even when unnoticed, then the real question is not whether it exists, but whether we are aware of it while living inside it. And that realization begins to quietly deepen everything we have been exploring so far. And as I continued reflecting on the idea that the human being might be experienced as an inner temple, where awareness is not just happening, but actually being held within a larger field of presence, my attention naturally began to move into another layer of this exploration. Because once you start noticing the space in which experience unfolds, you inevitably begin to notice the quality of what fills that space. And this is where my reflection slowly shifted towards something that, at first, I used to understand only in a poetic or symbolic way, but which began to feel increasingly experiential the more I observed my own inner world, the idea of an inner light. Now I want to be very honest here, because when I used to hear language like this, I would immediately place it in the category of metaphor. Something expressive, something meaningful in a literary sense, but not necessarily something I would investigate as a lived reality. But something changed when I stopped trying to interpret it quickly, and instead began noticing moments in my own experience where clarity itself felt like it had a quality. Not visual, not physical, but perceptual. Because there are moments when everything inside feels dense and unclear, when thoughts overlap, when emotional reactions arise before I can even recognize them. And in those moments, experience feels almost clouded, as if awareness is still present but heavily filtered. And then there are other moments, much quieter and less dramatic, where that density seems to loosen. Not because life becomes simpler externally, but because something in the way I am relating to experience becomes more still. And in those moments, there is a sense that clarity is not something I am producing, but something I am noticing, as if awareness itself becomes more transparent. And I want to stay close to that distinction, because it changed the way I started to understand symbolic language about light. Not as something entering from outside, and not as something mystical in a literal sense, but as a way of describing what it feels like when perception is no longer obscured by internal noise, when attention is no longer constantly divided, when the inner space we talked about earlier is not just recognized, but becomes quieter in its activity. And in that quietness, something subtle becomes available, a kind of clarity that does not feel constructed. It feels revealed. And this is where I began to understand why so many spiritual traditions, across different times and cultures, consistently use the language of light when speaking about inner transformation. Because light, in its most basic experiential sense, is what allows things to be seen without distortion. And when applied inwardly, it becomes a way of pointing toward the difference between a fragmented state of awareness and a more unified one. Because when awareness is fragmented, everything is filtered through competing internal movements. Thoughts interrupt perception. Emotions color interpretation. Memory reshapes the present moment without awareness. And in that condition, even when we are functioning normally in life, there is often a subtle sense of heaviness or confusion that is difficult to fully explain. But in moments when awareness becomes more unified, even briefly, something changes in the quality of experience itself. Not the content of life, but the way life is being experienced. And I find myself becoming more attentive to those moments, not as rare exceptions, but as indicators of something that is always available in principle, even if we are not always conscious of it. And I want to be careful here again, because I am not trying to turn this into a fixed explanation or a final interpretation. I am only sharing what becomes observable when I slow down enough to notice how my own perception shifts from state to state. Because the more I observe it, the more I realize that this so-called inner light might not be something distant or abstract at all. It might simply be the natural clarity of awareness when it is not being overwhelmed by fragmentation. And once that possibility becomes visible, even in a subtle way, it changes how I relate to everyday experience. Because it suggests that clarity is not something we chase, but something we uncover when conditions within us become less obstructed. And that realization quietly leads us into the final question that remains beneath everything we have explored so far. And as I continued sitting with this possibility that clarity, light, and perception might all be different ways of describing the same inner shift, I realized that everything we've been exploring naturally leads toward one final question I could no longer avoid. Because if these moments of clarity are real, even in the simplest sense of lived experience, then what exactly are we experiencing when we move between states of confusion and states of awakening? And this is where my reflection began to converge into something deeper. Not as an abstract idea, but as something I started noticing within the rhythm of my own inner life. Because there are moments when I am fully absorbed in thought, moving through the day almost automatically, reacting, planning, remembering, without ever fully stepping back to observe the process itself. And in those moments, life feels continuous, but not always conscious. It feels like I am inside experience, but not fully present to the fact that I am experiencing it. And then, without warning, there are other moments where something softens. The inner noise becomes less dominant. Attention becomes quieter, not forced, just less scattered. And in that subtle shift, there is a sense of being more here, more aware, more directly in contact with what is actually happening. Not through interpretation, but through presence itself. And I began to wonder if what we often call awakening is not something distant or dramatic, but simply this shift in how awareness is structured in the moment, a movement from fragmentation into coherence, from being lost inside thoughts to being aware of thoughts as they arise, from unconscious participation to conscious witnessing. And what struck me most is that this shift does not require me to become someone else. It requires only recognition, because the state I am looking for is not absent when I am unaware of it. It is simply unnoticed. And when I begin to see that, something in the entire search starts to change, because awakening is no longer positioned as a final destination in the future. It becomes a quality of presence that can appear in any moment when attention is no longer fully consumed by internal noise. And in that sense, what I used to think of as sleep and awakening begins to feel more like degrees of awareness rather than fixed states. Not absolute categories, but fluid movement within consciousness itself. And I find myself becoming more interested in those small transitions, those subtle moments when something inside shifts without effort, because they reveal something important. That clarity is not rare. It is just easily overlooked. And maybe that is what all of this has been pointing toward from the beginning. Not a new belief to hold, but a new way of noticing what has always been here, quietly unfolding within our own experience. When I look back at everything we've explored together, it becomes clear that this entire journey was never really about finding a new belief or discovering a hidden doctrine. It was about something far more subtle, and in many ways, far more personal. It was about the way we see. Because every idea we touched on, the single eye, the inner temple, the inner light, and even what we call awakening, all seem to point back to one quiet realization, that life does not change as much as our awareness of life does. And when I sit with that deeply, I start to notice something simple but profound. Most of the time, we are not lacking answers. We are lacking presence. We are not always missing truth. We are often just too absorbed in noise to recognize what is already here. And in those rare moments when the noise settles, even briefly, something becomes obvious without effort. Clarity is not something we chase. It is something we uncover when we are no longer fully entangled in fragmentation. That shift, however small it may seem, changes everything. Because it means that what we call awakening is not a distant event reserved for a few people or a future moment we must reach. It is a possibility that exists in how we are present right now, in the quality of attention we bring into this moment, in whether we are fully lost inside thought or also aware that we are thinking. And the more I reflect on this, the more I realize that the real practice is not about adding more to ourselves, but about noticing what is already happening within us without interference. So the lesson I take from all of this is surprisingly simple. Clarity is not outside of you. It is not hidden in a distant place, nor locked behind complex understanding. It appears naturally when awareness becomes less divided. And the way we begin to apply this in daily life is not through effort in the usual sense, but through small moments of recognition, pausing long enough to notice when the mind is scattered, observing when emotion takes over perception, and gently returning, even for a second, to the awareness that is observing all of it. Not to escape life, but to actually experience it more fully and directly. And maybe that is the quiet invitation behind everything we have been exploring together. Not to believe something new, but to see more clearly what has always been present. So I want to leave you with a simple question. When do you feel most present in your own life, even if only for a brief moment? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. I would genuinely love to hear how you experience this in your own way, because these reflections become even more meaningful when we explore them together. And if this journey resonated with you, consider subscribing to it BibleTalsis07. It truly helps support this channel and allows me to continue creating these kinds of deeper explorations and conversations with you. Thank you for being here and for walking through this reflection together.